It all began with the smell of barbecue drifting through the neighborhood. Mark Daniels, a middle-aged dad known for his grilling skills, had set up his smoker in the driveway. The sizzle of ribs, the laughter of friends, and music playing softly in the background painted the perfect weekend afternoon. Neighbors came by with side dishes, kids ran through sprinklers, and it felt like summer at its finest. But across the street, HOA Karen was not enjoying the smell. She was pacing in her yard, arms crossed, blonde bob perfectly stiff, pink cardigan buttoned tight, and her infamous clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her lips curled with every puff of smoke she saw rising. To Karen, this wasn't a backyard barbecue, it was a violation. She stormed to the edge of her driveway, shouting over the laughter, "This is against HOA regulations. No open flames outside the approved areas." Mark, tongs in hand, smiled politely. "It's just a barbecue, Karen. We're not burning down the neighborhood." That smile only enraged her more. The smell of burgers and ribs only grew stronger, drifting down the block like an invitation. Nobody could resist. The sizzling sound of fat dripping onto the coals was music to the neighbors' ears. But to one person, it was nothing short of a declaration of war. Karen's patience finally snapped. Her jaw clenched, her nostrils flared, and she whipped out her phone with the authority of a police chief about to make the arrest of the century. Her eyes locked on the gathering across the street as though she were watching a crime unfold. She paced in her driveway, heels clicking on the concrete, pink floral cardigan flapping slightly with each movement. "Yes, operator," she hissed into the phone. "I'd like to report an illegal fire hazard in my neighborhood. It's a direct violation of HOA regulations. This is an emergency." Her voice was sharp, dripping with self-righteousness, as if she were reporting a bank robbery. Across the lawn, neighbors exchanged looks, muttering under their breath. One whispered, "She's really doing it again." Another rolled his eyes so hard you could practically hear it. They had seen this routine before. Karen loved calling in the cavalry for the smallest infractions. Mark tried to brush it off, forcing a smile as he handed a plate of food to one of his guests. He didn't want Karen's antics to ruin the fun. But deep down, a knot twisted in his stomach. He knew Karen. She had a reputation for pushing things too far. She wasn't the type to complain and walk away. She was the type to burn the whole house down just to prove a point. Karen stayed on the phone longer than anyone expected, her voice rising with each exaggerated detail. "Yes, officer. There's smoke. I can smell it from my front yard. It's out of control, I tell you. There are children running around near it. This is a disaster waiting to happen." She paced back and forth like a lawyer rehearsing her case for court. Meanwhile, laughter continued at the barbecue, though quieter now. Guests glanced nervously at each other, unsure if they should stay or leave. Mark's wife leaned over and whispered, "Maybe you should just put the grill in the garage." But Mark shook his head. "It's a barbecue. We're not breaking any laws. I'm not going to let her bully us." And then, just minutes later, the wail of sirens sliced through the warm afternoon air. The unmistakable red and blue lights flashed as a black and white patrol car turned onto the street. Karen puffed up her chest with satisfaction. Standing taller, smug as a queen about to receive her throne, she strutted into the street like she had summoned the law itself, her clipboard tucked under one arm as if it were her badge of authority. "There," she cried, pointing dramatically toward Mark's driveway. Her finger cut through the air, like a dagger. "That's the violation. That's the danger to our neighborhood." She shouted it loudly enough for the entire block to hear, her voice quivering with the kind of passion most people reserve for actual emergencies. The party went silent, plates froze mid-air. Kids stopped running and stared wide-eyed at the flashing lights. The sizzle of the grill seemed louder in the sudden hush, each pop of fat echoing like a gunshot. Mark's neighbor, holding a beer, muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable. She really called the cops on ribs." Another whispered, "What's next? She'll call them if you sneeze too loud." Karen, meanwhile, marched closer to the arriving patrol car, her finger still jabbing toward the barbecue. She looked like someone who had just discovered buried treasure. "Officers, over here," she shouted, as though the smoke rising from the grill was a burning building. "This is a violation of our community code. They're endangering us all." The police car came to a stop in front of the house, and two officers stepped out. One adjusted his belt, scanning the scene with mild confusion. The other scribbled on a notepad, though his face suggested he was already regretting answering this call. The tension was so thick you could feel it in the air. Neighbors held their breath. Would the police shut down the party? Would Mark get a ticket? Would Karen, for once, get the satisfaction she craved? Karen seemed convinced of her victory. She squared her shoulders, lips curling into a triumphant smile. In her mind, this was already over. She had one dot. Mark set down his plate and stepped forward, meeting the officers halfway. His heart pounded, but his voice was calm. "Afternoon, officers," he said. "We're just grilling burgers and ribs for the neighbors. Everything's under control." But Karen cut him off before he could say more. "Don't believe him. This is a violation of the HOAS Code 4.7b, unauthorized. Open flame. He's putting us all at risk, and I demand immediate action." Her voice cracked with the intensity of her performance. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions caught between disbelief and irritation. One looked at the grill. The other scanned the happy faces of neighbors holding plates of food. Then, slowly, they turned to Karen, for the first time. It wasn't Mark who looked nervous, it was Karen. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone waited. Nobody moved. This moment would decide whether the party ended in cheers or Karen's smug satisfaction. Two officers stepped out of the car, their boots crunching against the asphalt. They moved slowly, calm, and professional, scanning the scene with the kind of practiced caution that comes from never knowing what to expect. Their radios crackled faintly. Both men looked at each other, as if silently asking, "Why were we called for this?" Karen, however, treated their arrival like the cavalry coming to save the day. She practically sprinted toward them, clipboard clutched against her chest, pearl necklace bouncing against her floral cardigan. "Officers," she barked, her voice slicing through the stunned silence of the street. "Thank goodness you're here. This man," she thrust her finger at Mark like he was a fugitive, "is endangering the neighborhood with an unauthorized, open flame. He is in direct violation of HOA Code 4.7b, and I demand immediate action." The words spilled out of her in one long, rehearsed monologue. She wasn't just reporting a complaint, she was prosecuting a case, playing judge, jury, and executioner, all at once. Her blonde bob gleamed under the sun, as she puffed herself up like she owned the entire cul-de-sac. Mark stepped forward, tongs still in one hand, towel in the other. He forced a polite smile, though everyone could see the tension in his shoulders. "Afternoon, officers," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're just grilling some burgers and ribs for the neighbors. Everything's under control. Nothing dangerous happening here." The officers glanced at the grill. They saw smoke rising lazily into the sky, heard the faint sizzle of meat, smelled the mouth-watering aroma of ribs. They looked at the kids, running around, the plates of food, the laughter that had been stifled when the squad car arrived, and then, finally, their eyes landed on Karen, who looked like she was about to explode with fury. One officer tilted his head, frowning slightly. "Ma'am, is this really why you called 911? Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few neighbors chuckled quietly. Mark's wife hid a small smile behind her hand. But Karen stiffened like she'd been personally insulted. Her jaw dropped, before she snapped it shut, and she jabbed her clipboard in the air so hard it looked like it might snap in half. "Yes," she shrieked. "This is a violation of our community laws. If you don't stop him, you're complicit in breaking the rules. The HOA clearly prohibits unauthorized flames outside of designated grills, and what you see before you is a disaster waiting to happen." Her shrill voice echoed across the cul-de-sac, each word bouncing off the perfectly manicured lawns, like gunfire. Mark's kids huddled closer to their mother, their little hands gripping her dress. The sight of Karen's rage and the flashing police lights was too much for them. She pulled them close, whispering softly, "It's okay, everything's going to be fine." But to the rest of the crowd, the tension was unbearable. Some neighbors exchanged nervous glances, others folded their arms, clearly fed up with Karen's theatrics. One muttered under his breath, "She's out of her mind." Another whispered, "Imagine wasting police time on burgers." Mark cleared his throat and tried again. "Look, officers, we're not doing anything illegal here. This is a family barbecue. We've got kids, food, music, kits, all harmless fun." He gestured to the grill. "The fire's contained. I've been barbecuing for years. This is safe." But Karen wasn't about to let him get the last word. She stomped closer to the officers, nearly bumping into them, and hissed, "Don't be fooled by his charm. He thinks he's above the rules. But if you don't act, then this entire neighborhood will descend into chaos. First, he grills in his driveway. Next thing you know, someone else will set up a bonfire. And then what? Do we just let anarchy take over?" The absurdity of her words made several neighbors snicker out loud. One man whispered loudly, "It's ribs, not a riot." A woman added, "Chaos. The only chaos here is you, Karen." Karen spun around, glaring at the onlookers like a queen betrayed by her subjects. "Quiet," she snapped. "This is a serious matter." Her face flushed red, and a vein pulsed at her temple. The officers exchanged another look, this one longer, heavier. They both seemed to realize that this wasn't about safety at all. This was about one woman's obsession with control. Finally, the taller officer let out a long sigh and spoke carefully. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is not an emergency. We were called here because you reported a fire hazard. What we see is a safe, ordinary barbecue." Karen gasped like someone had just slapped her. "Ordinary," she sputtered. "There is nothing ordinary about this blatant disregard for HOA rules. If you don't write him a citation, then you're ignoring the law yourselves." Her shrill protests rang through the air, but now they sounded desperate, even pathetic. The crowd shifted, some openly laughing, others pulling out their phones to film her meltdown. Kids peeked curiously from behind their parents, watching the grown-ups like it was a live performance. Mark crossed his arms now, the polite smile gone. He looked at Karen firmly and said, "Enough is enough. You can call the HOA all you want, but don't drag the police into this." We're just trying to enjoy our day." The officers didn't respond immediately, but their silence spoke volumes. They didn't see a criminal. They saw a man grilling food for his family, and they saw a woman with a clipboard who had clearly lost her grip on reality. Karen's face twisted into a mask of rage and disbelief. She wasn't used to losing battles like this. She wasn't used to anyone, not neighbors, not police. The tension was still thick, but it was no longer resting on Mark's shoulders. Now, all eyes were on Karen, and for the first time, she was the one who looked cornered. The silence after Karen's last outburst was almost painful. The only sound was the steady crackle of the grill and the faint hum of cicadas in the summer air. Neighbors held their breath. Kids stared wide-eyed, sensing something big was about to happen. And there stood Karen, trembling with rage, her clipboard gripped so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, the shorter officer broke the silence. He sniffed the air, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "Is that ribs?" Heads turned. Mark blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, smoked ribs. Burgers too. Want to see?" The taller officer glanced at his partner, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked back at the grill, then at Mark, then deliberately at Karen, whose jaw was still hanging open. Slowly, he said, "That smells really good." Laughter rippled across the crowd, tentative at first, then growing louder. Karen's face flushed scarlet. She stomped her foot like a child denied a toy. "This is not about food," she screeched. "This is about safety, about rules. You can't just—" She trailed off as the shorter officer stepped toward the grill. Mark, sensing an opportunity, lifted the lid dramatically. A cloud of smoky, savory aroma billowed into the air. The meat glistened, juices dripping as the coals hissed. The neighbors let out an audible ooh, as though they were watching fireworks. Even the officer's eyes widened. "Good Lord." The shorter officer muttered under his breath. "That looks amazing." Mark grinned. "You're welcome to a plate if you'd like. We've got plenty." He held up a pair of ribs with the tongs, the smoky glaze catching the sunlight. The taller officer chuckled softly and shook his head, but his eyes lingered on the food. He looked at his partner. "We really shouldn't," he began, but his voice lacked conviction. Karen, realizing what was happening, nearly shrieked. "You can't. You're officers of the law. You're supposed to uphold order, not," she sputtered, searching for words, her face twisted in disbelief. But the shorter officer had already accepted a rib from Mark's tongs. He took one bite, and his eyes closed like he'd just tasted heaven. The crowd erupted into cheers and laughter. Neighbors clapped, some hollering, "Yeah, Mark, and that's what I'm talking about." Karen looked like she might faint. This is outrageous," she screamed, pointing wildly at the officer. "You're eating evidence. This is a crime scene." The taller officer couldn't hold back his grin any longer. He reached for a paper plate, shaking his head as if to say, "What the hell? Why not? You got burgers too?" "Yes, sir," Mark said proudly, sliding a juicy patty onto a bun. He handed it over like a peace offering. The moment the taller officer took a bite, the entire mood shifted. The tension dissolved into laughter, chatter, and clinking plates. Kids cheered, neighbors raised their drinks, and the block party atmosphere returned stronger than before. Karen, meanwhile, stood frozen in place, clipboard trembling in her hand. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line of fury. "This isn't happening," she whispered, shaking her head. "This cannot be happening." But it was. The officers leaned against their patrol car, plates in hand, joking with neighbors as if they'd been invited all along. One of the kids even handed them sodas from the cooler. The scene looked less like a confrontation and more like a neighborhood festival. Mark's wife put her arm around him, whispering, "I think you just won the entire neighborhood." Mark chuckled, flipping another burger. "Nah," he said, glancing at Karen, who was now seething silently. "Karen just lost it." A neighbor shouted, "Hey officers, how's the food?" The shorter one gave a thumbs up, sauce smeared on his cheek. "Best ribs I've had in years." The crowd roared with laughter, clapping and cheering. Karen's eyes darted around in desperation, hoping anyone would side with her. But all she saw were smiles, raised cups, and laughter echoing in the summer air. Finally, she snapped. She stomped her foot again, and screamed, "This is a violation. This whole neighborhood is in violation, and I will report every single one of you." Her voice cracked on the last word. Nobody flinched. Nobody stopped eating. If anything, her tantrum only fueled more laughter. Someone even shouted back, "Write it on your clipboard, Karen." And the crowd burst into another wave of giggles. One officer, still chewing, calmly replied, "Ma'am, I think this situation is resolved." Resolved. Karen's face turned crimson again. "How dare you? This is abuse of power. This is—" But before she could finish, the taller officer interrupted, his voice firm but still amused. "Ma'am, we're not here to enforce HOA rules. We respond to emergencies. And from what I can see," he held up his half-eaten burger, "the only emergency here is how fast this food disappears." The entire block exploded into applause. It was the final nail in the coffin of Karen's crusade. She stood there, trembling, her authority shattered in front of everyone. For the rest of the afternoon, the barbecue continued like nothing had happened. The officers stayed, enjoying the food and laughing with neighbors. Music played louder, kids ran freer, and the air felt lighter than it had in months. And Karen? She stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. The only thing louder than that slam was the cheer from the neighbors who finally saw her lose. The slam of Karen's front door echoed down the street like a gunshot. For a brief second, the barbecue went completely silent. Then, as if on cue, the entire crowd burst into laughter, applause, and cheers that shook the cul-de-sac. It was as if months, maybe even years, of pent-up frustration had been released in one glorious moment. Mark raised his tongs like a trophy, grinning from ear to ear. "All right, folks," he called out. "Who needs seconds?" The crowd roared with approval, and suddenly the neighborhood barbecue wasn't just a casual get-together. It was a celebration of freedom from Karen's reign of terror. Inside her house. Though unseen, Karen was no doubt fuming. Curtains twitched as she peeked out, scribbling furiously on her clipboard, trying to salvage her dignity. But the damage was already done. The one thing Karen thrived on, fear, was gone. The neighbors weren't afraid anymore. Across the lawn, people who barely spoke before now mingled like old friends. A father from down the block shook Mark's hand. "Man, you just stood up to her in a way none of us could. You don't know how much this means." Mark chuckled, handing him a plate stacked with ribs. "Guess all it took was some good food and a lot of patience." The two officers, still leaning casually against their squad car, looked more like guests at a picnic than law enforcement. The shorter one wiped barbecue sauce from his chin and laughed. "You folks don't need cops, you need a block captain, and I vote for Mark." The crowd erupted in cheers again, clinking cups, some even chanting, "Mark, Mark, Mark." He waved them off, embarrassed but clearly pleased. Meanwhile, Karen finally cracked. Her front door swung open, and she stormed out, clipboard raised like a weapon. "This isn't over," she bellowed, her voice hoarse from screaming. "You're all in violation. Every one of you will be fined." But this time, instead of silence and compliance, she was met with something new: laughter. Loud, mocking laughter. One teenager even pulled out a toy megaphone and mimicked her voice. "Violation. Violation." The crowd doubled over. Karen's face turned crimson. "You can't laugh at me," she shouted, trembling. "I am the HOA board president. You owe me respect." Mark set down his tongs, wiped his hands, and stepped forward calmly, his voice firm. "Karen, no one here owes you anything. Not respect. Not obedience. Not fear. We live here too. This is our neighborhood, not your kingdom." The words hit like a hammer. Karen froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For once, she had no script, no bylaw to hide behind. The taller officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you abused emergency services today. We'll be filing a report." His tone was polite but sharp enough to cut through her pride. Karen's face twisted, horror flickering across it. She turned on her heel and stormed back into her house for the last time that night, slamming the door harder than before. As the crowd laughed and clapped, Mark's wife whispered, "That's it, she's done. She won't recover from this one." Neighbors nodded, murmuring in agreement. Someone shouted, "She just lost the whole street." And from that moment on, she did. The rest of the evening turned into a full-blown block party. Music played from someone's speaker, kids danced in the driveway, and neighbors who had long avoided each other bonded over Karen's downfall. People swapped numbers, made plans for future gatherings, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt like a community again. Mark raised his glass in a toast. "Two neighbors who stand together," he declared. The crowd cheered. Back to neighbors. The officers even raised their soda cans in solidarity. From behind her curtains, Karen watched in silence. The glow from the party lights spilled across her lawn, mocking her solitude. For years, she had thrived on control, weaponizing the rulebook against anyone who dared step out of line. But tonight, she wasn't feared, she was pitied. She was the villain in her own story, exposed and powerless. Word of the incident spread quickly. By the next HOA meeting, dozens of neighbors showed up, not in support of Karen, but against her. One by one, they voiced their complaints. Her fines, her bullying, her obsession with power. The board, embarrassed and overwhelmed, had no choice but to vote her out. Karen's fall from power wasn't just a victory for Mark, it was a turning point for the entire neighborhood. The fear she instilled was gone, replaced with unity. From then on, block parties became a regular thing. Neighbors, who once kept their heads down, began standing up for one another. And every time someone fired up a grill, they laughed about the night the cops came not to shut them down, but to join the feast. As Mark flipped the last burger that night, he looked around at the laughter, the friendships, the kids running free, and he knew something had changed forever. Karen could slam her doors, she could wave her clipboard, she could shout into the void, but she'd never ruled this neighborhood again, because once people stop being afraid, no HOA Karen in the world can control them.